Hello, my name is Jasmine Nanich. I am an Indigenous student currently doing my Master's of Counseling at Yorkville. I'm completing my practicum at Indigenous Psychological Services, and I've been honored to do a presentation on trauma research from an Indigenous framework. So with that, I want to start with land acknowledgement. So with respect and in the spirit of reconciliation and truth, we honor and acknowledge that where we are here in Alberta, where treaties 4, 6, 7, and 8 reside, are the traditional and ancestral territory of many diverse Indigenous populations. We acknowledge and are grateful to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations, and whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. So I just want to start with a bit of an introduction. I'm going to be going into quite a bit of research, and a lot of that is going to be based on Indigenous peoples and colonialism. And so Indigenous peoples have experienced many forms of trauma as a result of colonialism in the form of the residential school system, day homes, the 60s scoop that involved the child and welfare system, the continued racial discrimination thereafter, and how those events echo throughout generations, communities, and individual lives. But as we've seen, intergenerational trauma has affected so many groups in Canada and around the world. Within this research, I will be focusing on Indigenous peoples of Canada that include but are not limited to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So just some background into the research that is being done and has been done in the psychology field and what we're seeing. So trauma research and knowledge has grown immensely over recent years. Before we really understood it, trauma was explained as a type of shock or hysteria, going back to older terms of railway spine syndrome or shell shock. But through research and experience, we now see trauma as having many faces, affecting each person differently. And how we understand it at this point in time is that trauma is an overwhelming emotional experience related to a real or perceived threat to one's life or safety, or life or safety of another, and can happen at any point in time. And how that event is perceived is becoming more and more important in how we approach and implement trauma care. So why is this important? Well, this means that many different events can affect and trigger a trauma occurrence. But what this truly tells us is that it's the people's perspectives that matter, what they experience and continue to experience as a result of a trauma event, and how trauma can be passed down through generations and live within family systems, communities, and whole populations. We need to address it from this perspective because trauma is not one single event with a few bad symptoms, but often an ongoing, complex, and layered experience. And so some of the research that I've found, some recent research, talks a lot about the historical trauma and the effects it's had on Indigenous peoples. And historical trauma is the complex and collective trauma experiences held by a group or groups of people that share a history of oppression, victimization, or massive group trauma exposure. And this kind of trauma at such a massive level shows those groups or communities that have experienced such trauma are more vulnerable to diminished psychological health in later generations, such as increased exposure to sexual violence, the child welfare system, substance abuse, depressive symptoms, and increased exposure to trauma and rates of suicidal thoughts and attempts in Canadian Indigenous peoples, and so much more. So what helps us to understand these events is the trauma narrative of multiple group members within a community that helps us understand how the past affects present health. With that, the recognition and validation for those trauma narratives is also a source of healing for the past experiences where many feel they just want to be able to tell their stories and feel heard. So just as our Indigenous brothers and sisters have done so for many years, keeping these stories and narratives alive is important to the continued work being done to understand and find some healing from these wounds. So one of the research articles that I've found and I wanted to highlight here is by Muldoon and colleagues, done in 2019. So they recently discussed responses to trauma in terms of social psychology based on the social identity model of identity change. They hypothesized that response to trauma can be influenced greatly by the degree to which individuals have social identity. So group membership specifically has influence in psychological health as a protective factor. And within their argument, they note that strong group membership and social identity lower anxiety and raise self-esteem. However, in traumatic circumstances where individuals experience stigmatism or perceive stigmatism, will have a direct erosion to those social bonds and social identities that could be used as protective factors. For example, in cases of rape, where rape victims were perceived as highly stigmatized, had much greater difficulty accessing supports through their social connections. This is especially true for victims of trauma who felt they would be shunned or looked down on, created that sense of shame, which also acted as barriers to social bonds and group membership. As well, it's argued that in cases where trauma is caused by human acts versus like natural disasters, individuals can have an increased sense of betrayal and difficulty trusting others. This is even more so in cases of child abuse. And finally, in cases of trauma where an individual feels their family group or social group does not understand, does not want to discuss, or lack of recognition and acknowledgement is given, can decrease the likelihood that an individual will disclose or want to disclose. And so another study I found in 2020 by Barrage, Momper, and Gahn interviewed 40 participants who had attended a residential school in Saskatchewan. These participants gave video recorded testimonies of their experiences of the IRS system and the effects after. There were 3 themes that were found within each participant's testimonies: individual losses, losses of connection, and broader impacts. For individual losses, most of the participants reported loss of wellness, such as long-lasting pain and suffering, alcoholism, reactions to reminders of the IRS system, physical health problems, anger, and resentment. For loss of connection, most participants reported feeling the loss of connection to family and family members, and a loss of culture and language. This included a loss of intimacy, difficulty receiving and giving love, difficulty in parenting, and loss of connection to communities. Broader impacts referred to by some of the participants were in relation to the widespread impacts to the communities, such as higher rates of suicide, loss of connection within whole families, widespread anger and emotional abuse, and more. But what is also important about this is the direct observation and guidance to healing that these Indigenous people gave. What they felt was the right direction was finding a reconnection to others, being able to express and experience love, reconnecting to family, and reconnecting to culture. Reconnecting to culture as a group effort of community members through reconnection or rediscovery. And what was also made important was the ability to tell their stories and wanting to tell others their stories. Again, making space for the narrative and honoring the narrative of our people. And finally, forgiveness as part of the healing journey. Another important theme in the healing process was the wording of work that many participants referred to, such as doing the work myself, and I've been using my strength to work on myself, and the recognition that healing would be a long process. So what is needed? What I want to emphasize here from these studies and many others like it is that as we see these changes in our research and understand from an Indigenous framework that the sense of community, belonging, and cultural connection also needs to be integrated within our psychological approaches to mental well-being and emotional healing. The field of psychology has been mainly dominated by Western worldviews, and understandably, that's where a lot of the research has stemmed from. But we're in different times now. And although we come from a mainly Western psychological background, we also, and even more so, come from an Indigenous cultural background. And we can't heal effectively from only one perspective. If we continue to counsel Indigenous individuals from a non-Indigenous perspective, it's just another form of continued oppression and colonization. So with that, I bring up the two-eyed seeing approach. So our hope with the current research and the changes that are happening and that still need to happen within our worlds is that we take on the two-eyed seeing approach to counseling and psychology. The psychological field has made great strides to be more inclusive of culture and different ethnic backgrounds from more common Western backgrounds. But for Indigenous cultures, we need to take it a few steps further by including those elements that are needed for our people to heal, particularly by developing and expanding our knowledge of the effects of residential schools and the many collective traumas we share, and how that can come out in different ways, how trauma lives in the brain and body and is passed down from person to person, generation to generation, and how we as psychologists need to move towards culturally inclusive healing frameworks that not only include cultural practices, but integrating them in our own practice of helping heal the mind and body. So Suzanne Stewart discusses this model, Indigenous mental health and healing, which I think has really paved the way in terms of how we're utilizing the two-eyed seeing approach and drawing from more Indigenous ways of healing. What this model offers us is a framework by which we can try to blend the two worlds, Indigenous and Western psychology, by these 4 factors. So community, as mentioned, is not only a big part of the foundation by which we can feel that sense of belonging, love, and social connection, but it's also one of the major factors that was wounded by trauma. From a collective background, we often see our healing as part of the community or community well-being, as well as individual mental health and healing linked to our community. Meaning we need to view healing in terms of our community because without it, healing can be greatly affected. And at the same time, we must also approach it by each individual, as each person will have a different sense of mental health and healing in their own right. And with cultural identity, the knowledge of who we are within our culture and who we are as individuals affects our self-esteem, our self-growth, our connection to self and others, and how we cope through life. So promotion of this can simply be through cultural practices such as smudging, singing, through prayer, speaking native languages, through dance or ceremony, and can be done so through counseling practices to establish this identity, whether by strengthening it or reconnecting to it. And the holistic approaches refers to the psychological approach that is inclusive of many aspects of a person's being, as holistic approaches include all parts that make up the self, rather than just the thoughts or behaviors, but the spiritual and cultural as well, and how those parts are all equally important to healing the self. Through holistic approaches, we can then include more traditional Indigenous approaches to healing and beliefs and values within therapy. And then with interdependence, in terms of healing, refers to the connectedness we have with others, family, and our community, to other communities, and the importance of those relationships. In counseling, this is also held to high regard in terms of the relationship between the counselor or helper and the client, maintaining that these bonds help to heal through social connection, trusting relationships, and unconditional positive regard for one another. So in order to help heal, we can address it within counseling settings. However, even through the hard work and many efforts made by Indigenous Psychological Services and its counselors, therapists, and psychologists, we are still facing barriers to this goal. Right now, Canada has over 19,000 psychologists, but as of 2018, there's estimated to be less than 12 Indigenous psychologists practicing and/or teaching. And for on-reserve and off-reserve Indigenous peoples, they have a much higher rate of mental health issues than the general population. Despite disproportionately high rates of mental health problems in Native communities as compared to the rest of Canada, mental health services are underused by Native peoples. And this is very much due to the lack of cultural resources and Indigenous-led counseling services provided for our people. But this is also something that we hope will change as we continue on this journey with the two-eyed seeing approach to Indigenous healing and well-being. Healing from trauma is not an easy path. Recognizing and acknowledging it is there is not always fluid, and yet it's needed. It is needed for entire groups that have gone through major trauma and were taught not to acknowledge its presence. And as the research is now starting to show these trends, we know that trauma can echo throughout entire individuals, communities, families, and generations. But just like trauma, healing can also happen through individuals, families, communities, and generations. And so with that, I want to say thank you. I am honored to be able to present on this topic, and I hope that we can make some change.